Ancient History 206. We are in the age of Abraham today. Assigned reading was from, I believe, chapter 15, if I'm not mistaken, of Susan Bauer's book, Ancient History, or The History of the Ancient World. And in that book, she has given us some food for thought. In fact, I'm going to change my shared screen for a moment to pull up the textbook in Kindle. So there is an interesting thing here I wanted to show you. So this is the Kindle version of her book. So you may have noticed, or you may not have noticed, she places Abraham leaving Ur around 2166 BC. Okay. If you look at her timeline for the life of Abraham, in the very end of the chapter, she always puts these little timelines down here. And in this one, she's got Egypt on one side and Mesopotamia on the other. If you lean in close, you can see that she places Abram traveling to Canaan in the third dynasty of Ur during the time of Ur-Nammi. Which is interesting. She begins by postulating that Terah was born during the reign of Naram-Sin, who we talked about yesterday, right? So she titles this chapter The First Monotheist. And as I was talking to Kevin about before we started the recording, if by monotheist you mean a human who believes in one God, then Adam is the first monotheist. If you mean a monotheist is someone, any entity, any intelligence that believes in a one God, then God himself is the first monotheist. If you mean someone other than God who believes in the one God, then when the angels were created, they were the first monotheists. So the point is, to call Abram the first monotheist, I think, does injustice to Abram. It essentially suggests that either he made up the idea of the one true God, or that the one true God suddenly revealed himself to Abram, and no one else in the world knew he existed. Right? We're a little too soon after the flood for me to buy into the idea that no one else knew he existed, and it seems as though his meeting with Melchizedek would imply that there was at least one other monotheist in the world. Right? So one of the things we're going to talk about today is timelines again. So we'll get to that. In the meantime, let me go ahead and switch back to my PowerPoint for now. We're going to jump back and forth between the PowerPoint and the textbook today. I know we get into some deep stuff, and the problem with ancient history is in order to cram it all into 53 lessons, well, really 52 because there's, or even 51 because there's 2 final exams. But in order to cram it into around 50 lessons that are 80 minutes each, I constantly feel like I'm asking you to drink from a fire hose. You know, pointing the fire hose at you and saying, take a good drink. Meanwhile, you're being blown away by it and knocked over into the street. American history is even like that, right? And you know, if you think of American history as from the time of the Pilgrims until now, that's only a few hundred years as compared to the thousands of years we cover in this class. Um, so, chapter 7, the first monotheist. Let's go ahead and move over to the PowerPoint. Change the window, go to here, and go. All right. So, we are studying the age of Abraham. Note, this will be different if you're also taking Old Testament survey. This will be different than studying the personal history of Abram and Abraham in the Bible. What we're looking at here is the historical background of Abraham. So we're looking at this more from the eye of what's happening in the world around him than the personal story of Abraham, as it were. This, of course, is the map of ancient Sumer. This would be Sumer. This would be the main Akkadian Empire. Over here you have Assyria. Up here you have what is referred to as the Fertile Crescent, placed from Sumer all the way over to what we would think of as Syria. This area is called the Fertile Crescent. And Abram is from this little town on the river at near the mouth of the Euphrates River from the Persian Gulf, and he leaves Ur and goes this way, as we're going to see more in a moment. What's intriguing is to try to figure out, in all the history that we have already discussed since the time of the Great Flood, with the rise of civilization at Eridu and the city-states of Sumer, which is the same land I believe that the Bible calls Shinar. Shinar is Sumer. And this area began to be the cradle of civilization. And then the Akkadian Empire expanded that reach, and so on. So when in the course of these events, from the kings at Eridu and Uruk and Ur to the time of the prominent kings at Kish, and then finally Sargon and Akkad and his descendants, where in that history should Abraham be placed? Okay. This is the journey of Abraham and also a map showing the Exodus. So he starts in Ur, in what would later be known as Babylonia, or perhaps at that time was known as Babylonia. Some believe that Abraham belongs to the time of Hammurabi the Great, and others believe that he is much earlier, as does Susan Bauer. But he travels up through Babylon to Mari to Haran, and we don't know exactly how long he stayed in Haran, but it appears that he stayed in Haran long enough for his family to get settled, and then he continued on to Carchemish, to Halab, to Hamath, to Damascus, and entering the Holy Land, he comes to Shechem, and then to Bethel, where he makes the altar at Bethel, though in his time it's simply known as Luz. It was Jacob who would name the place Bethel a couple of hundred years later. In Hebron, he spends a great deal of time. He goes down into Egypt, northern Egypt, to the area where there were probably at this point Mesopotamian kings. He comes back to Hebron, stopping at Beersheba along the way, and kind of returns to re-enter his life. But the question is, when? You notice the map that I'm showing you says it was around 2000 BC. As we noted a moment ago, if you look in our textbook in chapter 17, 17 page 1, which I'm about to throw back on the screen. You don't have to grab for your book. I mean, your book probably should be open, but if it's not, I'm gonna put the page on the screen. Okay, so Susan says, or Dr. Bauer, if she prefers, that Abraham leaves Ur sometime after 2166 BC. I am going to say that that is probably one of the most accurate statements I have ever heard her make. But it's pretty easy to be accurate when you take a very early date and you say sometime after that, right? I would like to boldly declare that Abram left Ur of the Chaldees sometime after the flood. It's not much of a bold declaration, isn't it? Is it? So it was sometime after 2166 BC. That's not really helpful if we're trying to figure out who was king in Mesopotamia, who was ruling in the land of Haran, and what were the major city states at the time that Abram entered Canaan, and who the pharaoh might have been that he interacted with in northern Egypt, right? So with that in mind, let's just try to take a look at what causes that confusion. I don't know that I can untangle all of the confusion for you in one day, but I can at least give you some idea as to why so many people are so confused. So again, this is the map of Abraham's journey. And the question, of course, that arises is, when did Abram live? And to answer that, you have to look at two different sources. One is the biblical chronology, and the other is the historical chronology of modern historians. Or another way to put it is, one is to look at the biblical timeline, and the other is to look at the Gregorian calendar that says we are right now in the 2024th year of our Lord, or 2024 AD, right? So Jesus on this calendar is supposed to have been born in 1 AD. There is no 0. So the year before 1 AD is 1 BC. The problem is the Gospels are pretty clear that King Herod was alive when Jesus was born. Agree? Herod the Great? Anybody want to disagree with that? Was alive when Jesus was born? He died at Passover in 4 BC, which is one of the primary reasons that most Christian historians, including me, for whatever my opinion is worth in the ocean of opinions, believe that Jesus was probably born in BC 5 to early BC 4. I would place it in late December BC 4, or excuse me, in late December BC 5. Not later than the beginning of January BC 4 on our calendar. That's where I would come down on that. But the question then becomes, even if we look at, okay, we know what calendar we're using today, which historical chronology do we apply? Because there's the Egyptian chronology, which, by the way, is a mess, right? If you Google Egyptian chronology debate or Egyptian chronology controversy, you will find not one, not two, but as many as 10 to 12 different Egyptian chronologies of the pharaonic empire and all of its successive kingdoms. The number of dynasties is staggering. It's divided into major periods, right? Pre-dynastic age, the first kingdom, the first intermediate, the middle kingdom, the second intermediate. It's a vast time period. But you'll find up to a dozen different, with an easy Google search, different timelines based on how we interpret the ancient records of the Egyptians and the historians who wrote about them. But the earliest one outside of Egypt was probably Herodotus, if I remember correctly. And Herodotus was much, much later than the time of Abraham. But if you compare their chronology to Greek chronology, you have a problem. Does anyone know what that problem is? The problem is when you line up the common events recorded by the Greeks and the Egyptians, there's like a 300 to 600 year gap. And it's that gap that caused us to realize there must have been a Greek Dark Ages, right? What's interesting to me about that is they came up with a Dark Ages theory to explain what is essentially a black hole. It's not like we have stratas of the earth, layer after layer after layer, where we're digging up stuff where everything seems the same for this period, this period, this period, and this period. No, what happens is, according to modern chronology, which combines Egyptian and Greek chronology, there's just like 300 to 600 years missing from Greek history. We can't find it, which means that either as we dig more in ancient Greece, we'll find it, or that our expectation of how long Egyptian history is elongated. It's too stretched out. It was actually a shorter period. And you'll find that since the mid 1800s, well, actually the early 1800s, really, and even the late 1700s a little bit, you will find that since then, since we began digging up Egypt, we've been piecing together this chronology. Kitchen's put together his chronology, and gosh, that was just in the 20th century. But it kind of runs along with the accepted timeline of Egyptian history. The problem is it doesn't really take into account the number of times that there were multiple pharaohs ruling at the same time, and sometimes it was just two, one in the north, one in the south, but history isn't always that clean, right? Sometimes you have competing dynasties that start before the previous one ends, right? So depending on whose record you're looking at, and also remember, nobody was writing a history book in ancient Egypt, right? So what we are essentially doing is we're taking bits and pieces of information like a jigsaw puzzle and trying to piece them together, knowing we don't have the picture on the front of the box and we don't even have all the pieces. So that's why I, as a biblical historian, have this thought that since we have a unified document with a clear, discernible history from Adam to Jesus and beyond, that maybe what we should do is create the best biblical chronology we can. And when we create the best biblical chronology we can, then we can find common events between biblical history and Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, and later North African in Carthage and Roman history. Find the common events and use the biblical timeline to fit all of those into their places. And before this year is over, I'm going to actually show you what that looks like. But in the meantime, there is one guy who already attempted it, and that's this guy. The Annals of the World by James Ussher. There's James. Bishop Ussher was a brilliant man. If you don't have a copy of this book, you might not ever be able to get one because I don't know if it's even in print. I got this one during a time when there was an anniversary printing of it done on its, 400th anniversary or something. But this guy goes through and lines up the events of history with this is what it is in the Gregorian calendar, BC AD. This is what it is in the Jewish calendar, the year of the world. And this is what it is in his own timeline of from creation until now. Um, it was brilliant. But to answer the question, when did Abraham live biblically, we have to decide what chronology we're using and, in a sense, whose math we're using. For example, you've seen this chart before. This is a chart that shows the Masoretic and Latin Vulgate times of the Table of Nations and the pre-flood or antediluvian uh, patriarchs from Adam through Seth to Noah, and then from Shem through Terah, Abram's father. Okay? According to adding up the dates of when someone was born, or in Adam's case, created, how old he was at the birth of his son, and then moving that to what year it was that his son was born, and then he was 105 when Enosh was born. So 130 and 105 make 235, and so on. Terah was born in 1876, in the 1876th year of the world, and at 70, Abram was born, which would put us in the 1046th year of the world. 1946th year of the world when Abram was born. But if you look at the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is believed to have been derived from documents dating back to the time of Samuel, the Samaritan Pentateuch has a longer timeline, and it says that in the 2307th year of the world, Terah was born, which means that Abram would have been born in the 2377th year of the world. Okay? And you can see where some of the divergence is. If you look down to the very first divergence, it comes right here, Enoch. It says in the Masoretic text that Jared was 162 when he begat Eric. But if you look over here, it says in the Samaritan that he was only 62. So that gives us our first divergence in those two Hebrew Bible manuscripts. The Greek Septuagint, which the copies we have are actually older than our oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible, from which it was translated. The Septuagint timeline makes the problem even worse, because by the time you get down to Terah, you're already off by over 1,000 years. Terah, Abram's father. So that makes it complicated in trying to determine which historical chronology do we use. I'm sorry, which biblical chronology do we apply? But then we have another problem. When you take the world history chronology and you do your best to match it up, you have this problem. The timeline of the Old Testament manuscripts. Job was written somewhere in the around 1500 BC, probably. I think it might even be a little older than that. Then, of course, Moses wrote the law. And over that next little more than 1,000 years, the Old Testament was written, right? And it was being copied that whole time. We don't have the original copy of the Torah that Moses wrote in the wilderness. They didn't have it in the time of David, most likely, although there was a copy kept in the Ark of the Covenant shortly after the time of Solomon. It may have disappeared, or maybe it was still there when the temple was ransacked and destroyed in the time of in the time of the beginning of the exile when the Babylonians came. Just depends on whether you think that the real Ark of the Covenant went missing at the time of Solomon, as some argue, or if you think it didn't go missing until the Babylonian invasion. After the writing of Malachi, in the time of Alexander the Great, the Septuagint was translating the Old Testament from the Hebrew into Greek. Somewhere around the time just before the birth of Christ, the Dead Sea Scrolls were assembled, but they're all fragments. In between the Masoretic scribes beginning their work of translating the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in around 600 AD, and when the Old Testament was finished, somewhere around 400, there's almost 1,000-year gap between the Masoretes, who copied the Masoretic text, and the end of the Old Testament. Okay? The oldest Masoretic documents we have are right here, 600 AD, until the Dead Sea Scrolls. But all the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragments, not complete copies. Okay? The Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus are the oldest New Testament manuscripts we have, and they go back a ways. They go back, to the 3rd century-ish, but they're not really complete either. And I'll be honest, I'm suspicious of a Greek manuscript of the New Testament that has been in the custody of the Roman Catholic Church for almost all of this time, right? In order to get to see pictures of it, you have to get them from the Catholic Church. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but I wouldn't be surprised if that copy, because this was a copy, not an original, if that copy wasn't propagandized a little bit. The Sinaiticus, so-called, because it's it came from Egypt, and it was apparently one that was considered to be related to the Sinai manuscripts. It's old. If the criteria for what is the most accurate is what is the oldest, well, these are the oldest of the uncials. The manuscripts that we have that date from about just before 1000 AD for Greek, all the way back to the time of the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. We call those the uncials because they are copied in all capital letters. Then the Textus Receptus manuscripts are primarily, and keep in mind, the Textus Receptus is not a single document. It refers to a school of manuscripts. Okay, we have from roughly after 1000 AD until about 1600, those manuscripts came into existence. When Erasmus compiled them, he found that they were in near perfect agreement, but they don't always agree with the ones from back here. So the less than 100 incomplete fragmentary uncials do seem to sometimes contradict what's in the Textus Receptus. If your standard is the oldest is always right, then you're probably an uncials guy. If you're like me and you say, I would think that if you make 1,000 copies of something, it's harder to change, right? So I'm more of a Textus Receptus guy. But I don't think either of these camps should be mutually exclusive, because we should take all the evidence we have and do our best to make sure that we are translating what is actually the Word of God. But I said all of that to make this point, okay? We don't know whether the Septuagint dates are the original, because they were translated from the Hebrew long before our Masoretic texts were copied by the Masorite scribes. There were no Masoretes back here. Okay. Um, we don't know if this is more accurate or if it was the Septuagint that was corrupted by Christians, like, or alleged Christians, like Origen, who is thought to maybe have monkeyed with the timeline in the Septuagint, or if the Masoretes monkeyed with the timeline in the Masoretic text because they were trying to not give Christians certain things that they wanted in the timeline. Personally, I'll be candid, I don't buy either one of those stories. I'm not saying I trust Origen, but Origen didn't live in a vacuum, right? There were great Christian people in the time of Origen. Here's what I think happens. Over time, when you're copying something by hand again and again and again and again and again and again for what is now, roughly 3,500 years ago until roughly 1600, so roughly 6 to 700 years ago at most, when the copying stopped, right? When you go that long copying and copying and copying, there are going to be variants, right? What I find remarkable is that if you look at all the differences in the New Testament manuscripts, it comes out to less than 2% of the text. And there's really no doctrinal question that hinges on, if you go with the critical text and you're an NIV guy, for example, or you go with the received text and you're a King James guy, for example, you actually can still prove every major doctrine of the Christian faith, and the difference in the manuscripts comes down to less than 2% of the text. And it can be things like a pronoun is missing, right? So I think it's important to remember when we're doing these things with these dates, we have to remember that this is what we are dealing with, okay? So going back up here then, come on, one more. There you go. So which chronology do we apply? Well, I'm not going to take a position on that. I'm going to suggest that we look at what is the range during which Abraham could have lived, and then keeping in mind that we know that the post-flood written history of man is wrong on dates. How do we know that? Because frankly, the post-flood civilization absolutely, no matter which of these timelines you apply, absolutely was not there in 5,000 to 5,500 BC, right? It simply can't go back that far in line with Scripture. So we know that they have stretched out history. We're just not exactly sure where it's been stretched and where we need to condense it, which again we'll talk about before the end of the year. But if we apply these two major timelines, the Septuagint and the Masoretic, in their most common interpretations, because even if all you're looking at is the Old Testament and the King James Version or the New American Standard, this one right here, you're going to find people who interpret certain things differently in the narratives, okay? So let's go ahead and look at Abraham's life according to the Masoretic. So here's how we get back to Abraham. Solomon completes the temple in 950 BC to 1012 BC. Just for fun, not right now because focus on this, just for fun, later today or sometime this week, Google the phrase, when did Solomon build the temple? And see how many different dates pop up on the first page. But they're all going to range between 950 BC to 1012 BC. But guys, that's a 62-year span. That gives a lot of room, right? The most commonly accepted date is 967 BC in the fourth year of Solomon, or is the fourth year of Solomon when the temple was built. Counting backward to the Exodus from 1 Kings 6:1, you all remember what 1 Kings 6:1 says? And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So Solomon began building the house in the 480th year since the Exodus. According to the Masoretic text, then, that would be 1446 BC. Using Masoretic dates, the Israelites left Egypt after 430 years in Egypt, which means Jacob entered Egypt in 1876. That should say BC, not AD. Pardon that typo. In 1876 BC. Okay. And he was 130 years old. So that means 130 years ago, when Jacob was born and his father was 60, it was 2006 BC. That means that when Isaac was born, when Abraham was 100 years old, it was 2066. So Abram was born in Ur in 2166 BC. Oh, by the way, the reason this goes from 967 BC to 1446 and not 1447 is because it says it was in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the 480th year, which means 479 years had passed and we were somewhere in that next year. Okay, so 1446 is where we started. So Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old in 2066, which means Abram was born in Ur in 2166-ish. 2166 BC-ish. Which means that at 75 years old, Abram entered the promised land in 2091-ish. Which actually kind of seems to be pretty close to getting us into Bauer's timeline, doesn't it? Right? Kind of seems like it could be then. Okay. On the other hand, the one on which was the glove, Solomon completes the temple in 950 BC to 12 BC, according to the Septuagint, 967 BC. According to the Septuagint, it's only 440 years in 1 Kings 6:1. Back to the Exodus. So that means the Exodus date is 1406. Using Masoretic dates, the Israelites left Egypt after 215 years. Maybe. There's an asterisk on that. Because in the Septuagint, it says that the days of the sojourning and bondage of the people in Canaan and Egypt was 430 years. Okay. We know that from Abraham's entrance into Canaan until Jacob came to Egypt, it was 215 years. So if we assume that the start date for the sojourn of the children of Israel means when Abraham came to the promised land, then it's 215 years in the promised land and 215 years in Egypt. However, I don't know that we should interpret it that way, because it says in the Septuagint in Exodus that it was the children of Egypt in Canaan, or excuse me, the children of Israel in Canaan and Egypt, right? Well, Abram was the father of the Israelites and others, but he was not one of the children of Israel. So does it start when Isaac was born? Does it start when Jacob was born? Does it start when Reuben was born, the first son of Jacob? who is Israel. But Paul tells us that it was 430 years from the giving of the promise. Okay, is that when Abram was in Ur and he first was told, go to a land that I will show you? Was that from after Abram got into the promised land and he was 75 and God said, I'm going to give you this land right here, this land? Was that when after he had separated from Lot, when God said, I'm going to give you a son? Is it from there? Is it from when God showed up between the opened animal and barbecued the animal and came to Abram and said, this is what I'm going to do? Is it from the year before Isaac was born when God came and told them they were going to have a son the next year? Is it when Isaac received the promise after the death of Abraham when God spoke to him? Is it when Jacob was at Bethel? Is it the promise that was received when Jacob was on his way into Egypt? From the giving of the promise could refer to multiple points in the life of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And that is the only guidepost we have in the New Testament to what is meant by the time of the sojourn in Exodus. So, using the Masoretic dates, the Israelites, on the most common interpretation, left Egypt after 215 years. That means Jacob entered Egypt at 1621. And again, that should say BC. That's twice in 2 slides I did that. He was 130. Jacob was born when his father Isaac was 60 in 1751. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 in 1811 BC. So Abram was born in Ur in 1886 BC. Abram entered the promised land in 1811 BC. That's a 255-year range for the life of Abraham. And because of this, maybe on where in between the 430 years and the 215 is the split. When did they actually enter Egypt? And I won't go through that again, but which giving of the promise? That's why I'm saying it's a range. Somewhere between this date, 1811 BC, and this date, come on, just go one page, there you go, 2091, Abram entered the promised land to 1811. So there's a 255-year range, and I'm going to tell you, I prefer the Masoretic text most of the time. It is the Hebrew text. I have no reason to doubt the integrity of the Masoretes. However, there are times when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament and the text is different than it is in the Masoretic text. In other words, if you compare what you're reading in the New Testament in your English Bible to the passage that is being quoted in, say, Isaiah, it doesn't line up exactly. But when you open up your Brenton's translation of the Septuagint, you go, oh, dude, Paul was quoting the Septuagint. And more often than not, when there's a variant between the Masoretic text in the Hebrew Old Testament and the Septuagint, the New Testament quote, more often than not, matches the Septuagint. So while I do think we should have a strong preference for reading the Old Testament in Hebrew, I don't think we should be so quick to say, well, if they disagree, the Hebrew is always right and the Septuagint is always wrong, when the Holy Spirit inspired New Testament writers to quote the Septuagint, even where it's variant from the Hebrew Masoretic text that we have. Now, before we move on from this slide, is anyone just thoroughly confused? I see no one raising their hand. Okay. So somewhere between 1811 BC and 2091 BC, in that 255-year range is when Abram entered the promised land. Okay? You will find that Bauer thinks it was early in that time. But here's a couple of guys who disagree with her. Hallie's Bible Handbook. Another person who disagrees with her is Unger's Bible Handbook. Now, I'm not saying that these guys are better or worse historians than Dr. Bauer, but I do think they're probably better Bible students. So my suggestion is, as you come to your own conclusions about these things, always remember that the Bible cannot be wrong, but that we do have two different lists of dates. And in that range, look for the historical events that seem to most fit the biblical narrative, because we already know we can't trust the secular historical timeline of the ancient world, right? So if there's, for example, if there's a pharaoh in the right range that fits the narrative of Genesis for Abram and his visit there, then we're probably going to be able to line that up. If there's a pharaoh that fits the Joseph narrative, then we're probably going to be able to line that up, right? I said in Old Testament survey yesterday that I think Jacob and Joseph came into Egypt during the reign of the Hyksos dynasty. This date fits that well. But I could be wrong, and it could be this date, 1876, and you're like over 200 years too early for the Hyksos here. Okay? So, someday Jesus will probably be the world's greatest historian and straighten all this mess out for us. When he comes back, that is. So, remember this, the Akkadian dynasty? According to Bauer, who, by the way, is a genius, and I don't ever mean to speak of her in less than respectful terms, but she is a secular historian, and being a secular historian gives you a certain bias. To be fair, being a biblical historian gives me a bias too, but she is a secular historian, I'm a biblical historian, so there are times when I may seem to scoff. I'm not doubting her expertise, I'm not doubting her intelligence, only her conclusions, because she's not understanding that the Bible is the Word of God and the ultimate and final answers must come from there. But according to her, Terah was born during the reign of Naram-Sin. You all remember Naram-Sin? It's been a long time since we talked about him. About 24 hours. Y'all have slept since then. During the reign of Nimrod-Sim is when she says Terah was born, which would mean that probably not during the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, but maybe during the time of Dudu, or even Shudarul, Abram might have been born, or he might have been born immediately after that during the upheaval of the Akkadian dynasty falling to the Gutians and the first dynasty of Ur rising up in Sumer. Okay. We don't know. But that would be her timeline. The Septuagint chronology, of course, would put him more close to the time of Hammurabi the Great and the early Babylonian Empire, the first Babylonian Empire. So ruling from Babylon, Hammurabi the Great would have been in the 19th century BC, which again is what Usher and Unger both think is the right time period. So, who's right, who's wrong? God's right, everyone else is wrong about something. God's right about everything. I'm right about some things. But what we know for sure is that somewhere in this 200 plus year period in Ur of the Chaldees, Abram was born. At some point, he and his family migrated to Haran over here. And then when he was 75, Abram traveled down to the land of the Canaanites. Okay? Just checking our time. Still got about 24 minutes. All right. So it's important for us to be aware of those things when we're reading ancient history other than in the Bible. We need to always remember they can't help it. They're just wrong. Not necessarily wrong about the events, but wrong about the timeline. Okay? I don't take it for granted that when the Mesopotamian document known as the Sumerian Kings List says that the first king after the flood ruled for hundreds of years, I don't necessarily take that to be true and accurate, but I also don't discount it if he was actually a grandson or great-grandson of Noah, or maybe even a great-great-grandson. He might have lived an especially long time, but I don't think that we could have a succession of multiple kings that lived long lives after the flood, because it just makes history too long. Okay, so with that, let's go back to our textbook and see what kind of information we can get from Bauer, and then we can each figure out, that was a mistake. Change windows. I picked the window that our chat is in, or excuse me, that our video conference is in. So it just started going into an infinite black hole of showing a picture of a picture of a picture of a picture. All right, chapter 17, the first monotheist. Once again, Abram is not the first monotheist. Interestingly enough, another person who is given the title of first monotheist by some historians is actually an Egyptian pharaoh. An Egyptian pharaoh who said that there is only one God, but it wasn't our God, the God of Abraham. It was one Egyptian God, and all the other Egyptian gods were phonies. And that was a few hundred years after this, around the time of Moses. So if you want to have some fun, look that one up later. But neither of them are the first monotheist. In human terms, Adam was the first monotheist. But take a look at just a couple of things in page 1. Sometime during the Sumerian struggle with the Gutians, a citizen of Ur named Terah collected his servants, his livestock, his wives, his sons, and their families, and set off westwards. Among the household was Abram, Terah's son, and Abram's wife Sarai, who had the misfortune to still be childless. Terah was not a Sumerian, but perhaps an Akkadian or a member of a related tribe. He traced his ancestry back to Shem, the biblical progenitor of the Semites. Born sometime during the rule of Naram-Sin, Terah had probably never lived in an Ur that was free of the Gutian threat. Remember, the Gutians were the ones who essentially finished off the Akkadian Empire. Okay? During this time, during his childhood, Ur had taken advantage of the weakening power of the Akkadian kings to free itself from Akkadian dominion. By the time he became the father of three sons, the last Akkadian king was making a final stand for the throne. As his young family grew, the Gutians wrecked Agaday and ranged freely across the northern plains. So, if that's accurate, and it is relatively within our timeline, right? 2166 BC, we're close. If it's accurate, that gives us an interesting historical context for Terah. I am somewhat curious as to how she came to the conclusion that our friend Terah is not Sumerian, though, right? It seems that the people of Sumer, some of them were Shemites or Semites, and some of them were Hamitic, and there may have even been some Japhethites mixed in. But we know for sure that there were at least descendants of Ham and Shem that were in this region and still are today. So I am curious how she comes to the conclusion he's not an Akkadian, or that he is an Akkadian, and doesn't give any explanation. She could simply mean that he was born during the time of the Akkadian Empire and not during the time of the Sumerian independence before the Akkadian domination. I don't know. I just wish she would give us more explanation for that. Sometime around that time, Uta-Hegel was marching towards Ur. The Gutians are on their way. Sometime around the time that Uta-Hegel was marching towards Ur to take it over and lose it again to his son-in-law, Terah and his family decided, understandably, that they would be better off out of the city. They set off according to the book of Genesis towards Canaan to the west, and excuse me a second. And towards the Mediterranean shore and away from barbarian Gutians, vengeful Elamites, and ambitious Sumerians. So this could be true. I mean, this could be the time frame. I actually think that from a biblical timeline of history, it's probably somewhere between too early and too late. Because I believe that ancient history is elongated, meaning the events may have really happened, but they're stretched out too far on a calendar or timeline. I'm thinking that in terms of the events in the region, it may have actually been earlier than that Abram left Ur. But in terms of the year, I think it's too late. I think it's too early. So, but she does give us a lot of information about the world in which we are living in either case. So that's important. Of course, Abram had heard the voice of God, and it was not a Sumerian god or an Akkadian god. That's true. A god who gave himself the puzzling name YHWH, a name whose pronunciation is lost to time because the Israelites won't speak it out loud. We think it was Yahweh. The Germanic transliteration of the Latin transliteration of the Greek transliteration of the name in Hebrew is Jehovah. We think it was pronounced Yahweh, but there are no vowels in ancient Hebrew, so all we know is there's a Y, an H, a W, and an H. Should there be a vowel sound in between the H and the W? I don't know. Should it be 3 syllables or 2? I don't know. She says possibly a form of the verb to be. I will take issue with the word possibly. It is most obviously, to anyone who looks at the Hebrew words, Yahweh is clearly a form of the word to be, and that's why God translated it, I am. Simply, I am the one who is. God said, I am the existing one. Because everyone else's existence is contingent, but God is necessary. God is the one who must exist, who has always existed, who will always exist. Everything else is contingent. God's being is the source of all being. She argues that this seems to have been a new idea for Abram, and that Terah and his sons were likely to have been worshippers of the moon god Sin and his daughter Inanna, the patron deities of the city of Ur, simply because all Ur natives paid at least lip service to the moon cult. Okay, let's pause there for a second. I actually agree that Terah was an idol worshiper. His name means idol, and he was likely an idol maker. The Book of Jubilees, the ancient Targum, and other ancient Eastern sources indicate that he may have even been the royal idol maker, or he may have worked for the temple. Having said that, I think it's interesting to look at, what is our biblical thought concerning, who was Terah, what was his important significance, and how much attention should we pay? I get the impression, though, that the knowledge of God wasn't lost completely from this culture. It doesn't seem as though God tapped Abram on the shoulder and said, by the way, I'm the one true God. Everybody you know has forgotten me, and there's nowhere on earth where you can have a friend who is also a believer, but I'm real and you can trust me. I don't think we're that far removed from the flood, right? Yes, every nation on earth was worshiping other gods, but I don't think it was true that Shem, who according to the Masoretic timeline is still alive at this time, Shem didn't remember who God was, right? I don't think that's possible. I think that Arphaxad probably knew who God was, the son of Shem. And I think that these, that monotheists existed, but they were just becoming a smaller and smaller minority. And Abram chose to defy his father, the idol maker, and throw in his lot with the one God minority. And God picked him to be the father of the faithful. But Abram gets both a promise and a command. You're going to be a great nation. I'll bless you. Go to the promised land. Okay? But he doesn't just go west, which would take you across the desert. He took the normal route of going north and staying in the Fertile Crescent and then coming south from Syria into the promised land. Okay. It's interesting because in the days of Abram, a battle took place that involved up to 9 different kingdoms, some say 10, and the kings of some of them are named, right? You remember Genesis chapter 14? It's fascinating to me how overlooked this passage is in Genesis 14:1. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bershah, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. All right. This is after the separation from Lot and before the birth of Ishmael. We're early in the time of Abram's sojourn in the kingdom, in the land of the Canaanites. We're early. Let's say, when Ishmael was born, Abram was 86. He was 75 when he got there. That's 11 years. Let's say he's around 80, 81 years old. He's been there long enough to be established, but it hasn't been that long. Okay? He and Lot have already separated. Lot is living in Sodom. This battle takes place. So all you really have to do is look for evidence in history of a time when there were leagues of nations from Mesopotamia coming together into central Canaan to wage war. And see if any of these names might fit a king at the time in any one of those kingdoms. Most people believe that Amraphel is probably Hammurabi the Great. I don't think you can definitively prove that, but it makes sense. So it seems then that maybe this could fit the timeline of the Septuagint and secular history if this is around the time of Hammurabi the Great. But I'm not sure that the evidence is that conclusive. Egypt, in any event, is a fledgling nation. We are out of the time of the pre-dynastic period and early dynastic period because someone has the title of Pharaoh. And we're probably in the First Kingdom era of Egypt. Okay? Abimelech is a Hittite, child of Heth, ruling in the area that would later be known as the Philistines' land, or Philistia. Okay? We find Melchizedek ruling Salem, the village that would eventually grow to become Jerusalem. But we don't know enough about him to make any heads nor tails of that. There have been times in and around the period where the 255-year gap, in that time frame, where there were environmental factors based on ancient records along with geological evidence, where there were environmental factors that would have made mass migration out of Mesopotamia and up the Fertile Crescent to Syria and even down into Canaan attractive. Much like we see in the days of the patriarchs, sometimes there's a famine where you live, so you go somewhere nearby and you come back home later. So there may have been some of those things happening. I think it's important to remember, though, that it's not just the setting of Abraham that really matters, it's the legacy of Abraham, right? The three largest religions in the world are the Abrahamic religions: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Abraham is the father of the faithful. He is claimed by each of those faiths as the spiritual forefather of their belief system. He made a big splash in a big way, spiritually, religiously, and nationally. And literally millions of his children are spread out in every corner of the world. So let's just very quickly go down to the end of the chapter, and I want to point out she does have a map for us of Abraham's world. Almost looks like a hand sketch. It's not bad. There's the Persian Gulf. Here's Arabia. And you notice this is where Abram comes from. This is the route that he would take. And he comes down into the Promised Land. But this desert, nobody crosses that desert if they don't have to. Not on camel, not with mules. You go up through the Fertile Crescent. Also, let's go down to the end. Okay. Shilgi reigned in Ur, and Abraham was fought constantly to keep his family safe. It was a rough time to be in Canaan. During this time, the walls of Jericho alone were damaged and repaired 17 different times. Abraham had fathered not one but two nations. Actually, that's not a complete list. There's more than two. Both of his sons were marked with the sign of the covenant, the ceremonial removal of the foreskin that created a physical difference between them and the other Semites who were battling over the rough land between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan River. But this difference gave them no edge in the struggle for territory. When Sarah died, almost 30 years after giving birth to Isaac, the clan still had so little land that Abraham had to buy a cave from a nearby Western Semitic landlord in order to bury his wife. The part that I want you to focus in there is he acknowledges that the Abimelech at this time is a Western Semitic person. He's not a Philistine. The Philistines are descendants of the Greeks. This guy is, according to Genesis, one of the children of Heth, a Hittite. Okay? He's surrounded by enemies, but he somehow still manages to make friends. He is the father of the faithful and a great example to all of us. He is not the first monotheist, but he is the father of the faithful and the friend of God. Any final comments before we dismiss?